At his new job tending the gardens of a millionaire's sprawling villa, a dedicated gardener noticed a small girl watching him curiously from behind glass windows. He was surprised to learn the wealthy owner had a daughter, and strangely, he never saw her step foot outside the house. But the moment he finally got a chance to speak to the girl, what she confessed to him made him realize something terrible was happening inside those walls, and he knew he had to act fast. Before we dive into this gripping story, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. The gentle breeze of early spring whispered through the meticulously manicured gardens of the Hale mansion. Daniel Dan Wells, a gardener in his early 50s, wiped a bead of sweat from his brow as he carefully trimmed the overgrown bushes that lined the property's expansive grounds. The sky above was a patchwork of soft clouds and glimpses of blue, providing a pleasant respite from the harsher weather of recent weeks. Dan's weathered hands moved with practiced precision, his pruning shears snipping away at errant branches with a rhythmic cadence. He had been working at the mansion for the better part of 4 months now, and the vast gardens had become a familiar canvas for his horticultural artistry. As he worked, he couldn't help but reflect on how fortunate he felt to have landed this particular job. The sound of tires crunching on gravel drew Dan's attention away from his task. He straightened up, his back protesting slightly after being hunched over for so long, and turned to see a sleek, black luxury car pulling into the circular driveway. The vehicle came to a stop in front of the grand entrance, its engine purring softly before falling silent. From the driver's seat emerged Christopher Hale, the millionaire owner of the estate. Chris, as he preferred to be called, was a man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke volumes of his wealth and status. As he stepped out of the car, his polished leather shoes gleaming in the dappled sunlight, Chris's eyes met Dan's across the lawn. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hale," Dan called out, raising a hand in greeting. "Beautiful day for some gardening, isn't it?" Chris's face broke into a warm smile as he approached, his gait relaxed and confident. "Indeed it is, Dan. I'm glad you could make it out today. The garden's been looking a bit wild after a month without your expert touch." Dan chuckled, gesturing to the overgrown foliage around him. "You're not wrong there, sir. There's quite a bit to be done, but I'm grateful for the cooler weather. Makes the work a lot more pleasant." As Chris drew closer, Dan could see the faint lines of stress around his eyes, barely noticeable beneath his friendly demeanor. The millionaire ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, his gaze sweeping across the expansive grounds. "Listen, Dan," Chris said, his tone thoughtful. "I appreciate you coming out here on such short notice. I know the garden's a big job, especially after being neglected for a while. If you need anything while you're working, a drink, coffee, or even lunch, don't hesitate to ask the chef. He'll be happy to serve you." Touched by the considerate offer, Dan replied, "That's very kind of you, Mr. Hale, thank you. I'll be sure to take a break if I need one." Chris nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good man, well, I'll leave you to it. I've got some work to attend to inside, but if you need anything, just ring the front bell." With a final smile and a wave, Chris turned and made his way up the grand steps to the mansion's ornate front door. Dan watched him go, a sense of appreciation washing over him. In his years of working as a gardener for various wealthy clients, he had encountered his fair share of demanding and unpleasant employers. Chris Hale, however, had always been different, kind, considerate, and generous with both his money and his respect. The contrast was stark. Yesterday's client had been a penny-pinching taskmaster, expecting miracles on a shoestring budget and offering nothing but criticism in return. Here at the Hale mansion, Dan felt valued and respected. The pay was excellent, $50 an hour was more than fair for his expertise, and the working conditions were superb. The vast gardens that encircled the property provided a peaceful environment, far removed from the stresses of everyday life. As Dan worked his way around to a new section of the garden, he noticed the wind picking up slightly, rustling the leaves above him. He glanced at the sky, noting the gathering clouds on the horizon. The weather report had mentioned the possibility of rain later in the day, and he made a mental note to pick up his pace. There was still so much to be done, and he wanted to make the most of the dry weather while it lasted. Just as he was about to start on a particularly overgrown rosebush, the sound of the front door opening caught his attention once more. Dan looked up, expecting to see perhaps one of the house staff, or maybe Chris heading out on an errand. Instead, what he saw made him pause, pruning shears suspended in mid-air. Chris stood in the doorway, but gone was the relaxed, friendly demeanor from earlier. Now his face was etched with worry, his eyes darting frantically across the grounds. As their gazes met, Chris hurried down the steps. "Dan!" Chris called out, his voice tight with barely concealed panic. "Dan, have you seen a little girl out here? My daughter." Surprised by the question and the evident distress in Chris's voice, Dan shook his head. "No, sir, I haven't seen anyone. What does she look like?" Chris hesitated for a moment, his eyes continuing to scan the area, as if hoping the child would suddenly appear. "She's 7 years old, wearing a beanie. You're absolutely sure you haven't seen her?" Dan's brow furrowed as he thought carefully, trying to recall if he had glimpsed anyone matching that description. "I'm certain, Mr. Hale. I've been out here for almost an hour and haven't seen a soul besides yourself." Chris's frown deepened, and Dan could see the worry etched into every line of his face. "All right, thank you, Dan. If you do see her, please let me know immediately. I'm going to check with the other staff members." As Chris hurried back into the house, his movements jerky and urgent, Dan couldn't help but feel a twinge of concern. In all the months he had worked at the mansion, he had never seen or heard mention of a child living there. He wondered briefly if perhaps the girl wasn't allowed to play outside, or if she spent most of her time at other properties owned by the family. Shaking off his confusion, Dan returned to his work, but now his senses were on high alert. As he moved from plant to plant, he found himself constantly glancing around, half expecting to see a small figure darting between the bushes or hiding behind a tree. The peaceful atmosphere of the garden had been disrupted, replaced by an undercurrent of tension. As he worked, Dan's mind wandered to his own experiences as a father. The memory of his own daughter, lost so many years ago to a rare form of leukemia, surfaced unbidden. He remembered the panic and fear that would grip his heart whenever she was out of his sight for even a moment. The thought of Chris's missing daughter seemed to have reignited those past traumas, making it difficult for him to refocus on his work. Time seemed to slow as Dan continued his work, each rustle of leaves and distant bird call drawing his attention. The garden, which had always been a place of peace and satisfaction for him, now felt charged with an unseen energy. As he moved from one section to another, Dan found himself hoping fervently that the little girl would be found safe and sound. As the morning wore on and midday now approaching, Dan noticed the wind picking up and the sky growing more overcast. The threat of rain loomed on the horizon, spurring him to work faster in an attempt to complete his tasks before the weather turned. He moved methodically through the various sections of the garden, his experienced hands making quick work of the overgrown foliage. The incident with Chris and the missing girl still weighed heavily on Dan's mind. As Dan approached one of the mansion's large bay windows, he found himself so absorbed in his work that he didn't immediately notice the figures standing just beyond the glass. It wasn't until he heard a soft knock that he looked up, startled to see Christopher Hale standing there with a little girl in his arms. The child wore a pink beanie that covered her head entirely and a long-sleeved Mickey Mouse sweater pajama top paired with kid-sized jeans. Dan's heart leapt with relief, realizing this must be the daughter Chris had been searching for earlier. He watched as Chris pointed towards him, seemingly explaining the garden and Dan's work to the girl. However, as Dan observed the pair, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between Chris's animated gestures and the girl's demeanor. Where Chris appeared to be trying to engage and cheer up the child, she remained expressionless, barely even glancing in Dan's direction despite his friendly wave. The girl's apparent disinterest and unhappiness struck Dan as odd. He wondered if perhaps she was feeling unwell, given her attire. Long sleeves in the afternoon suggested she might be running a fever or battling the flu. As he pondered the situation, the girl turned and walked away, with Chris following close behind. Dan refocused on his work, keenly aware of the darkening sky. Yet, his thoughts kept drifting back to the girl's cold expression. Something about her demeanor and the way she wore her beanie stirred a painful memory, one of his own daughter, lost to leukemia at just 2 years old. The weight of that loss, even after 25 years, suddenly felt fresh and raw. Dan's mind wandered back to those difficult days, recalling how it had all begun with a rash on his daughter's face. He remembered watching helplessly as it spread across her entire body, intensifying whenever she cried. The blood tests, the diagnosis, the painful bone marrow extraction that had left his little girl in agony even after the anesthesia wore off. It all came flooding back. He could still hear the oncologist's words echoing in his mind, explaining how rare the condition was, affecting only 1 in a million children worldwide. The grueling chemotherapy sessions, the mounting medical bills, and the gut-wrenching realization that despite their best efforts, they were running out of both money and hope. Lost in these painful memories, Dan didn't realize he had begun to cry until he heard the front door of the mansion open. Quickly wiping away his tears with the hem of his blue uniform, he forced himself to refocus on the task at hand. He reminded himself that those events were decades in the past, that his daughter was at peace now, watching over him from heaven. As he blinked away the last of his tears, Dan caught sight of Chris exiting the house once more. The millionaire walked past him with a smile, seemingly unaware of Dan's emotional moment. "I'm heading out for a bit to pick up a few things," Chris called out. "My daughter's inside with the nanny. Looks like rain's coming. If it starts before you're done, feel free to take shelter in the staff area. You can rest and grab a bite to eat there until it passes." Dan was touched by the man's thoughtfulness. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Hale. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. Please be careful on the road." As Chris drove away in his luxury car, Dan redoubled his efforts to complete his work before the weather turned to worse. As he moved towards the back of the property, he found himself near another large window. This time, movement inside caught his eye, and he looked up to see the little girl standing alone in what appeared to be a spacious living room. She stood motionless, her gaze fixed on Dan with the same unhappy, cold expression he had noticed earlier. Determined to lighten the mood, Dan smiled warmly and waved. "Hello there," he called out, loud enough to be heard through the glass. "I'm Dan, the gardener. What's your name?" The girl hesitated for a moment before responding in a quiet voice that Dan could barely hear. "Jocelyn," she said, her expression unchanging. Dan's smile widened. "That's a beautiful name, Jocelyn." But the girl still remained silent. To lift the girl's spirits, Dan decided to make a joke. He picked a few leaves from a nearby shrub and playfully perched them atop his head, transforming himself into a comical bunny. He bounced around, wiggling his nose and flapping his arms as if they were big, floppy ears. To his delight, he caught a glimpse of Jocelyn's lips twitching into a smile for the first time, her cold demeanor softening as a hint of joy flickered in her eyes. Encouraged by her reaction, Dan leaned closer, his voice warm and inviting. "How about you come outside and watch me create beautiful flowers in the garden? I could use a helper." He gestured toward the window, but Jocelyn's expression fell and she shook her head slowly. "I'm not allowed to go outside," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. Confused by this strange rule, Dan gently probed, "Why not, sweetheart?" But Jocelyn merely shook her head again, unwilling or unable to explain further. Sensing her discomfort, Dan decided to change the subject. "You know, I used to have a daughter too. She was younger than you, but she was also a quiet girl like you. Her name was Jeline." As soon as the name left his lips, Dan was struck by the similarity between Jocelyn and Jeline. The coincidence stirred something deep within him, and he noticed a change in Jocelyn's demeanor as well. It was as if the shared syllables had formed an unexpected bond between them. Slowly, almost hesitantly, Jocelyn reached up and removed her beanie. Dan's heart sank as he saw her completely bald head, a sight all too familiar from his own daughter's battle with cancer. The telltale sign of chemotherapy brought a flood of emotions rushing back. Before Dan could offer words of comfort or support, the sound of tires on gravel announced Chris's return. Jocelyn's eyes widened with what looked like fear, and she quickly disappeared from view, leaving Dan standing alone in the garden, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. As Chris pulled up and began unloading groceries from the trunk, Dan observed him with a mix of curiosity and concern. The sight of the heavy bags piled high with fresh produce and snacks tugged at his instincts as a gardener and his deeper urge to help. Dan wiped his hands on his apron and took a step closer, contemplating the burden that Chris must have carried as a father of the sick girl. "Hey, let me give you a hand with those," Dan offered, taking a few steps forward, ready to lift the weight off Chris's shoulders. He couldn't help but wonder where the maids were. Wasn't there staff to help him with such tasks? Chris paused for a moment, looking up from the groceries with a polite smile. "Thank you, but I've got it covered," he replied, his voice steady and calm. Despite the easygoing tone, there was something in his demeanor that suggested he preferred to manage things on his own. Dan nodded, acknowledging the man's wishes. As he stepped back, he caught a glimpse of the contents of one of the boxes still in the trunk. Among a collection of wigs, he noticed a bottle of over-the-counter hair growth serum. The sight puzzled him, bringing to mind the specialized treatments his daughter's oncologist had mentioned years ago when they had halted her chemotherapy. Driven by a mix of concern and his own painful memories, Dan broached the subject carefully. "Mr. Hale, I didn't realize your daughter was ill. Jocelyn showed me earlier when you're gone, and I just wanted to say I'm so sorry. I actually lost my own daughter to cancer, and I remember her oncologist mentioning a specific medicine for hair regrowth after chemo. Minoxidil, I think it was called." Chris's reaction was immediate and intense. His face flushed red with anger as he snapped, "That's none of your business. You have no right to speak to my daughter or involve yourself in our personal matters. If I catch you talking to her again, you're fired on the spot. Do you understand?" Taken aback by the sudden outburst, Dan stammered an apology, but Chris didn't seem to listen to him, absorbed in his own anger toward the man. Chris fully closed his car's trunk, leaving the box behind in the car trunk as he walked briskly toward the house. Dan stood there for a moment with his swirling thoughts and a heavy sense of guilt. As the weight of the encounter settled in, Dan tried to reason in his head that it was all his fault for giving the man unsolicited advice and stepping out of the line. He should have understood how difficult it was to be a parent to a child with cancer. He had been a sensitive person during those times with his own daughter. This whole thing with the daughter facing cancer must have taken a personal hit to him. He made a mental note to apologize to Chris later, hoping the tension would ease with time. Dan headed back toward the garden, this time making his way directly to the backyard. Before rounding the corner, Dan casted one last glance over his shoulder, wishing he could rewind the event earlier. However, as he watched toward where the car was parked, this time Dan noticed Chris emerging from the house again. He walked back to the car, retrieving the box he had left behind. Curiosity gnawed at Dan as he continued toward the backyard, wondering why Chris hadn't called for his staff to assist him. Surely, a man of his means wouldn't have to handle everything on his own, especially in a business suit that was now at risk of being ruined. Was this his way of demonstrating dedication to his daughter, or was there something else behind it? As Dan worked in the back garden, the atmosphere shifted. Suddenly, thunder rumbled ominously in the sky, and rain began to pour down in heavy sheets. He realized he couldn't continue his work in the downpour, but he couldn't just leave everything behind, especially the remnants of the plants he had weeded and cut earlier. Quickly, Dan made his way to the staff area, seeking shelter from the impending downpour. The sudden change in weather mirrored the tumultuous thoughts swirling in his mind. As he stepped into the warmth of the building, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and something savory cooking wafted through the air, a stark contrast to the damp chill outside. There he was greeted by the chef, who smiled warmly. "Ah, you must be the gardener," his round face breaking into a warm smile. "Perfect timing. You must be soaked to the bone. Come, sit down. I've just put on a fresh pot of coffee, and lunch will be ready soon." Grateful for the distraction, Dan made his way to one of the chairs, sinking into its soft cushions with a weary sigh. "Thanks, chef. That sounds wonderful." As the chef poured him a steaming mug of coffee, Dan glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already 1 p.m. He hadn't realized how quickly the time had passed. The rich aroma of the coffee filled his nostrils as he wrapped his hands around the warm mug, the heat seeping into his chilled fingers. "Rough morning?" the chef asked, noticing Dan's pensive expression. Dan nodded slowly, taking a sip of the coffee before responding. "You could say that. The garden needed a lot of work, and then—" He trailed off, unsure how much he should say about his interaction with Chris and Jocelyn. Before Dan could decide whether to mention about the girl, the door to the staff area opened again. A young woman entered. She was dressed in a simple but neat uniform, her dark hair pulled back into a tidy bun. Her eyes met Dan's, and she offered a small smile as she approached. "You must be Dan, the gardener," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Maya, Jocelyn's nanny." Dan stood to shake her hand, noting the warmth in her grip. "Nice to meet you, Maya. Yes, I'm Dan." Maya joined them at the table, accepting a mug of coffee from the chef with a grateful nod. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, the sound of the rain outside and the kitchen's cooking the only noises in the room. Dan's mind wandered back to Jocelyn, and he found himself speaking before he could think better of it. "Maya, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is Jocelyn all right? I saw her earlier and she seemed unwell." Maya's expression shifted, a mix of concern and caution crossing her features. She glanced around the room as if checking to see if anyone else was listening, before leaning in closer to Dan. "Jocelyn has leukemia," she confided in a low voice. "She was diagnosed about 6 months ago. I think it was the all type." Dan felt his heart sink. All acute lymphoblastic leukemia was more common than the rare JMML that had taken his own daughter, but it was still a devastating diagnosis. "How is her treatment going?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Maya's brow furrowed, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "That's the strange thing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For the first few months, she had regular chemotherapy sessions. A private doctor would come to the mansion, but lately, I haven't seen any medical professionals. Mr. Hale still gives her some medicine, but I'm not sure what it is, and honestly, she doesn't seem to be getting any better." Dan felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of the kitchen. Something about the situation felt off, and alarm bells began ringing in his mind. He thought back to the over-the-counter hair growth serum he had spotted in Chris's car. Typically, such serums were used after chemotherapy, not during it, and even then, they were often prescription products rather than over-the-counter options. This realization contrasted sharply with the specialized treatments he remembered from his own daughter's illness that had taken most of his finance, treatments that were tailored and carefully monitored by her oncologist. The pieces weren't fitting together, and a sense of unease settled over him. What was really going on with Chris and his daughter? Dan's thoughts raced as he struggled to make sense of it all, the unease growing like a storm cloud in his mind. "What about her mother?" Dan asked, realizing he had never seen or heard mention of Mrs. Hale. Maya shrugged, a shadow passing over her face. "I've only been here for 5 months, replacing the previous nanny. I've never asked about her mother. Mr. Hale is very strict about staff gossiping, especially about family matters." As their conversation drew to a close, the chef announced that lunch was ready. The aroma of a hearty beef stew filled the air, momentarily distracting Dan from his troubled thoughts. As they ate, the conversation turned to lighter topics, but even as Dan participated in the small talk, his mind was racing. The brief rain shower had passed, and he knew he needed to return to his work in the garden. But as he stepped back outside, the beauty of the manicured landscape seemed at odds with the unsettling mystery surrounding the little girl inside the mansion. The air was fresh and clean after the rain, the plants glistening with droplets of water. Under normal circumstances, Dan would have reveled in the perfect conditions for gardening. But now, as he picked up his tools and resumed his work, he found himself constantly glancing back at the house, his thoughts filled with concern for Jocelyn. As he methodically trimmed and shaped the lush foliage, Dan couldn't shake the image of Jocelyn's bald head and the fear he had glimpsed in her eyes. The similarities to his own daughter's battle with cancer were too striking to ignore. And yet something about this situation felt fundamentally wrong. The gentle rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds provided a soothing backdrop to his work, but Dan found it difficult to lose himself in the familiar rhythms of gardening, as he usually did. His senses were on high alert, every movement from the house drawing his attention. Suddenly, a flash of movement drew his attention. Dan looked up to see Jocelyn sprinting toward him from the back door of the mansion, her face streaked with tears. Maya trailed behind her, but the girl was clearly faster. Before Dan could respond, Jocelyn hurled herself into his arms, clinging to him with desperation. "Whoa, easy there," Dan said softly, his heart racing. He knew that if Chris saw them like this, he'd be fired on the spot. But the girl's distress was palpable, and he couldn't bring himself to push her away. "What's wrong, sweetheart? You're not supposed to be outside, remember?" Jocelyn looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and pain. "Please, I need your help," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't feel good. My head hurts so much and it's hard to breathe. It feels like there's water in my lungs when I try to take a deep breath." Dan's blood ran cold. He knelt down to her level, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. "Slow down, honey. Tell me exactly what's happening." The little girl took off her beanie, revealing her bare scalp. "My head hurts all the time, and I'm always so tired," she explained, her words tumbling out in a rush. She placed a hand on her chest. "And it hurts here when I breathe. I told Daddy, but he said it would go away on its own. But it's not going away, and I'm scared." Dan felt a surge of anger and fear. These symptoms were serious, potentially life-threatening. How could Chris ignore them? "Jocelyn, we need to tell your dad right away. We'll go together, and I'll help you explain how bad you're feeling. He needs to call a doctor." But Jocelyn shook her head violently, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, please. He'll just put me back in the room. No doctors come anymore. It's been so long since anyone come here." The desperation in her voice shattered Dan's heart. He glanced up at Maya, recalling what she had told him earlier during lunchtime. It all clicked into place, and a wave of growing horror washed over him as he realized this wasn't a recent development. Jocelyn had been suffering like this for a while, with no medical intervention. Dan made a split-second decision. He couldn't stand by and watch this child suffer, not when he had the power to do something about it. "Okay, Jocelyn, listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We're going to get you help, all right? But we need to be quick and quiet because I need to get my phone in my van to make a phone call." He took her small hand in his and led her towards the front of the property where his van was parked. His mind raced, formulating a plan. He needed to call for help, but he also understood that doing so would mean crossing a line. Chris would likely fire him, or worse, report him for overstepping. As they reached his van, Dan quickly retrieved his phone from his bag. But before he could dial, a furious shout rang out across the lawn. Chris had emerged from the house and was storming towards them, his face contorted with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Chris bellowed, grabbing Jocelyn's arm roughly. "I told you to stay away from her." Dan stood his ground, his protective instincts kicking in. "Mr. Hale, please listen. Jocelyn is in pain. She needs medical attention immediately." But Chris wasn't listening. He shoved Jocelyn towards the house, his grip on her arm visibly tight. "You're fired, Dan. Get off my property now before I call the police for trespassing and overstepping." In that moment, watching the fear in Jocelyn's eyes as she was dragged away, Dan knew he had to act. He raised his phone, his finger hovering over the emergency call button. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hale, but I'm the one who's calling the police. This child needs help, and if you won't provide it, I'll make sure someone does." Chris froze, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "Think very carefully about what you're doing, Dan," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Some things in life are better left alone. This is one of them. Hang up that phone now or you'll regret it." But Dan had made his decision. With a steady hand, he dialed 911, his eyes never leaving Chris's face as he gave the dispatcher the address and a brief explanation of the situation. As he spoke, he watched Chris's expression change from anger to something closer to fear. Without another word, Chris turned and rushed back into the house, dragging a sobbing Jocelyn with him. Dan could hear the sound of doors slamming and muffled crying from inside. As he waited for the police to arrive, Dan stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding. He knew he had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Whatever happened next, there was no going back. He only hoped that he had done the right thing for Jocelyn's sake and for the memory of his own daughter who had lost her battle with cancer so many years ago. The minutes dragged on agonizingly as Dan waited for the police to arrive. The once peaceful garden felt eerily quiet, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze and the soft patter of raindrops falling from the foliage. Dan's eyes remained glued to the mansion's imposing front door, his heart racing with worry for Jocelyn and uncertainty about what would happen next. Each passing second intensified his anxiety, and he couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away, leaving them vulnerable in a situation that felt increasingly precarious. After what felt like an eternity, but was closer to 15 minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the mansion's gates. Dan's heart leapt with a mixture of relief and apprehension as he watched the officers approach. However, their demeanor was not what he had expected or hoped for. "Sir, are you the one who called the police?" one of the officers asked. "Yes, I am, officer," Dan replied, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "And who are you?" "My name is Daniel Wells. I was a gardener at Hale's mansion, but the man just fired me for trying to save his daughter. You see, his daughter, Jocelyn Hale. We're well aware that she is sick. Everyone here know Mr. Hale and his family." The officer interjected, his tone brusque and authoritative. Dan felt a mix of relief and frustration. At least they understood the gravity of the situation. But he could sense that the officer's demeanor suggested he might not be ready to fully listen to Dan's concerns. "Yes, officer, you see, the daughter told me she was sick and denied medical care." But one of the officers cut him off, saying, "Sir, you mentioned you were fired. Why are you still here? We need you to step outside the property. Staying here constitutes trespassing." Dan's heart sank as the officer's words hit him. He opened his mouth to protest, to tell them they are missing the point, but the authority in the officer's voice made it clear that there was no room for argument. Dan felt a surge of frustration, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Officers, please, you don't understand. I'm not the one who's done wrong here. There's a child in danger in that house. She needs medical attention immediately, and her father is denying it." The second officer held up a hand, cutting him off. "We'll investigate your claims, sir, but for now you need to wait outside this gate. We can't have you interfering with our work." Reluctantly, Dan stepped beyond the property line, his heart heavy with worry. He watched anxiously as the officers approached the front door, noting how quickly Chris answered their knock. From his vantage point, Dan couldn't hear the conversation, but he observed intently, trying to glean any information from their body language and expressions. To his surprise and growing concern, the interaction seemed cordial. Chris's demeanor appeared calm and collected, a far cry from the enraged man Dan had confronted earlier. After a brief exchange, Chris stepped aside, allowing the police to enter the house. Minutes that felt like hours passed. Dan paced back and forth along the sidewalk, his mind conjuring increasingly worrying scenarios. What if they didn't believe Jocelyn? What if Chris managed to convince them everything was fine? Just as Dan was about to call out to the officers, the front door opened again. What he saw next made his blood run cold. The officers emerged, laughing and chatting amicably with Chris. As they descended the front steps, Dan caught a glimpse of one of the officers discreetly tucking an envelope into his pocket. Disbelief and anger surged through Dan as the officers approached him. Before he could speak, one of them addressed him curtly. "Sir, we've investigated the situation and everything appears to be in order. The child is fine and has denied any mistreatment. This seems to be a misunderstanding." Dan couldn't believe what he was hearing. "That's impossible," he exclaimed, his voice rising with desperation. "Did you even examine her? Did you speak to her alone? She needs medical attention." The second officer's expression hardened. "Mr. Wells, we've done our job. There's no evidence of any wrongdoing here. If you continue to make these accusations, we'll have no choice but to arrest you for false reporting and harassment." As the reality of the situation sank in, Dan felt a wave of despair wash over him. The system that was supposed to protect the vulnerable had failed spectacularly. Chris had somehow managed to buy his way out of trouble, leaving Jocelyn trapped and suffering. The officers returned to their vehicles, leaving Dan standing alone outside the gate, feeling helpless and defeated. As he watched them drive away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed a grave injustice. The image of Jocelyn's frightened and painful face burned in his mind. Dan knew he couldn't simply walk away now. He had come too far, seen too much. But what could he do against the combined forces of wealth, corruption, and indifference? Dan returned to his van, parked just outside the mansion's gates, his mind a whirlwind of emotions and half-formed plans on how to help the girl. Each option he considered seemed to leave him vulnerable and embroiled in controversy. The weight of what he had witnessed, the apparent corruption of the police, Chris's menacing behavior, and most importantly, Jocelyn's desperate plea for help, pressed heavily upon him. He sat behind the steering wheel, gripping it tightly as he tried to sort through his thoughts. What could he do? Calling for help had only made things worse, and he felt powerless to change Jocelyn's fate. As he contemplated his next move, a sudden realization struck him. His gardening tools were still in the backyard. These tools were expensive, and the thought of having to replace them only added to his frustration. Despite the risk, he decided he needed to retrieve them. Cautiously, Dan scanned the property. Seeing no sign of Chris or the police, he made a split-second decision. With surprising agility for a man his age, he vaulted over the fence and made his way stealthily towards the backyard. The damp grass muffled his footsteps as he crept along the side of the house, his heart pounding in his chest. As he rounded the corner of the mansion, movement caught his eye. There on the indoor terrace stood Jocelyn. She was with Maya, her nanny, and both were pressed against the window. Jocelyn's face was tear-stained, and even Maya looked deeply concerned and scared. Dan's heart clenched at the sight before him. He couldn't just leave them like this. He had to save her one way or another, even if it meant taking an unusual route, now that the situation had become so dire and the police were unhelpful. Approaching the window of the mansion, he gestured to Maya, mouthing, "Can you open it?" Maya shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. She mimed turning a key, indicating that the window was locked. Frustration and determination warred within Dan as he scanned his surroundings, his gaze landing on a sizable rock nestled among the flower beds. Without giving himself a moment to second-guess his actions, he picked it up and held it aloft, locking eyes with Maya, who looked taken aback and shook her head vigorously in protest. Dan understood that what he was about to do was reckless, and even dangerous. He could easily end up in jail. But the urgency of the moment outweighed his fears. The look on Jocelyn's face echoed too closely to that of his daughter, Ghislaine, and in that instant, all he could see was her image. He couldn't ignore the connection he felt, and the overwhelming need to act, to do something that might save the girl from the pain his daughter once endured when she was still alive. Taking a deep breath, he steeled himself for a leap of faith, clinging to the hope that it would lead to a positive outcome. He nodded at Maya, and as understanding washed over her, she realized Dan was fully committed to his plan. Swiftly, she guided Jocelyn away from the window and stepped back herself. It was evident that Maya recognized the seriousness of the situation and had decided to lend her support. With all his might, Dan hurled the rock at the window. The sound of shattering glass seemed deafening in the quiet afternoon. Wasting no time, he cleared away the remaining shards and reached for Jocelyn. "Come on, sweetheart," he urged, his voice low and urgent. "We need to go now." Jocelyn didn't hesitate for a moment. She extended her arm, and Dan quickly reached through the broken window to lift her up. Just as he secured her, Maya appeared behind them, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "I can't come with you," Maya said quickly, her voice trembling, "but please take her, keep her safe." Dan nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Maya. We'll get her the help she needs." With Jocelyn in his arms, Dan raced back towards the front of the property. His heart pounded in his chest, every rustle of leaves making him fear discovery. As they reached the fence, he gently set Jocelyn down. "The gate is locked, so I'm going to lift you over, okay?" he explained softly. "Then I'll climb over and help you down on the other side." Jocelyn nodded bravely, her small hand gripping Dan's tightly. With a grunt of effort, Dan hoisted her up and over the fence, then quickly scrambled over himself. In moments, they were both safely on the other side. Not daring to waste another second, Dan scooped Jocelyn up again and sprinted to his van. He buckled her into the passenger seat, his hands shaking with adrenaline. As he slid behind the wheel, reality crashed over him. He had just committed a serious crime, kidnapping in the eyes of the law. But looking at Jocelyn's pale, frightened face, he knew he had made the right choice. Starting the engine, Dan pulled away from the mansion, driving several hundred meters down the road before pulling over. He needed to think, to plan their next move carefully. "Jocelyn," he said gently, turning to the girl, "I'm going to call the police again, but this time I'm going to ask for their supervisor. We're going to make sure they listen this time, okay?" Jocelyn nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Dan took a deep breath and dialed 911 once more. "This is an emergency," he said as soon as the dispatcher answered. "I need to speak to a police supervisor immediately. The officers who responded to my earlier call were corrupt. There's a child in danger, and we need help now." As he spoke, Dan's resolve strengthened. He knew the risks he was taking, knew that if he was wrong about his suspicions, he could face severe legal consequences. But the alternative, leaving Jocelyn in that house, suffering and neglected, was unthinkable. "Please hurry," he urged the dispatcher. "We'll be waiting right here." As he ended the call, Dan turned to Jocelyn, offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "We're going to get you the help you need, I promise." In that moment, as they sat together in the van waiting for the police to arrive, Dan felt a fierce protectiveness wash over him. Whatever happened next, he knew he would do everything in his power to keep this child safe. The memory of his own daughter, lost so many years ago, fueled his determination. This time, he wouldn't fail. This time, he would make a difference. The tense silence in Dan's van was broken by the wail of approaching sirens. Within minutes, several patrol cars pulled up, their lights flashing. Dan's heart raced as he saw an unmarked vehicle arrive last, likely the supervisor he had demanded. "Okay, Jocelyn," Dan said softly, turning to the frightened girl beside him. "The police are here to help us. I need you to be brave and tell them everything, all right? Tell them about how you've been feeling, about the lack of medical care. Can you do that for me?" Jocelyn nodded, her small hand gripping Dan's tightly. "I'm scared," she whispered. Dan squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I know, sweetheart, but I'll be right here with you. You're not alone anymore." As they exited the van, they were immediately surrounded by officers. The supervisor, a stern-looking woman in her late 40s, approached them. "I'm Detective Sergeant Meta Reeves," she introduced herself. "Mr. Wells, I understand you have some serious allegations to make, but first, I need you to step away from the child." Dan hesitated, reluctant to leave Jocelyn's side. "Please, you need to listen to her. She needs medical attention immediately." Detective Reeves nodded, her expression softening slightly as she looked at Jocelyn. "We'll take care of her, sir. But for now, I need you to wait in your van while we speak with the girl." Reluctantly, Dan complied, watching anxiously from the van as Detective Reeves knelt down to speak with Jocelyn. He could see the girl's lips moving, her small hands gesturing as she spoke. The detective's face grew increasingly grave as she listened. After what felt like an eternity, Detective Reeves approached the van. "Mr. Wells, I need you to tell me everything you know, from the beginning." Dan took a deep breath and launched into his account. He told her about his work at the mansion, his observations of Jocelyn, the conversation with Maya, and Chris's suspicious behavior. He explained about the hair growth serum, the lack of medical care, and the symptoms Jocelyn had described to him. As he spoke, he could see the detective's expression changing from skepticism to concern. When he finished, she was silent for a moment, processing the information. "Mr. Wells," she said finally, her tone serious, "based on what you've told me and what the child has said, we have enough to investigate further. But I need to warn you, Taking the child from the property, regardless of your intentions, was illegal. You could be facing serious charges. Dan nodded, a lump forming in his throat. I understand, but I couldn't leave her there. Not when I knew she needed medical care. Detective Reeves seemed to consider this for a moment before continuing. We're going to need to question everyone involved. The staff at the mansion, including the nanny you mentioned, Maya, and of course Mr. Hale himself. As if on cue, more sirens blared in the distance. That will be the Child Protective Services and the medical team I called, Detective Reeves explained. We're taking this matter very seriously, Mr. Wells. My team and I are going into the mansion now to find Mr. Hale and conduct a further investigation. Before she stepped away, she added, I regret having to say this, but I must warn you, you're up against a powerful man. There's a possibility that this entire situation could turn against you due to your actions, taking the child. I understand, officer, Dan replied. Despite the warning, Dan felt as a wave of relief washed over him. Finally, someone in authority was listening and taking action. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. There's something else you should know. There's a nanny inside named Maya. She helped me and Jocelyn. Please, make sure she's safe. She was trying to protect the girl, too. The supervisor nodded. We'll make sure to speak with her. For now, I need you and the girl to wait here with Officer Johnson. We'll update you as soon as we can. As the supervisor and his team made their way towards the mansion, Dan and Jocelyn were left standing by the van with Officer Johnson, a young policeman with a kind face. The air was thick with tension as they watched the other officers disappear into the house. Officer Johnson turned to them, his expression softening as he addressed Jocelyn. Hey there, sweetheart. I know this is all pretty scary, but you're safe now. Can I ask you a few questions? Jocelyn nodded timidly, her small hand still clutching Dan's tightly. Can you tell me your mother's name? Officer Johnson asked gently. Jocelyn's voice was barely above a whisper as she replied, Her name was Bella Lawson. But she's gone now. Officer Johnson nodded sympathetically, then turned to his radio. Dispatch, I need a background check on a Bella Lawson, wife of Christopher Hale, deceased. Can you pull up any information we have on file? The radio crackled with static for a moment before the dispatcher's voice came through. Copy that, Officer Johnson. Give us a moment to search the database. As they waited, Dan knelt down beside Jocelyn, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. You're doing great, he murmured. Just a little bit longer, okay? The minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. The only sounds were the distant chirping of birds and the occasional crackle of police radios. Dan's eyes remained fixed on the mansion, watching for any sign of movement or news. Finally, the radio sprang to life again. Officer Johnson, this is dispatch. We've found the file on Bella Lawson. Deceased, as reported. But there's something odd about the case. It was closed unusually quickly, and there's a lack of proper documentation. It's as if someone rushed through the investigation and closed it without following standard protocols. The whole thing looks suspicious. Officer Johnson's brow furrowed as he listened to the report. He exchanged a meaningful look with Dan, who felt a chill run down his spine. What had really happened to Jocelyn's mother? Before they could discuss the implications of this new information, a commotion at the mansion's gate caught their attention. Several officers were emerging from the property, and in their midst, handcuffed and looking disheveled, was Christopher Hale. Dan instinctively drew Jocelyn closer, shielding her from the sight of her stepfather being led to a waiting patrol car. The man shot them an angry, hate-filled glare, but remained silent. In response, Jocelyn buried her face in Dan's side, her small frame trembling slightly. As Chris was placed in the back of the police car, another group of officers began setting up a large tent just outside the mansion's gates. More vehicles arrived, and Dan recognized the insignia of forensics units and additional investigative teams. The police supervisor approached Dan and Jocelyn, his face grave. Mr. Wells, we're treating this as a major case now. The entire property is under investigation, and we're escorting all staff members out for questioning. I'm afraid we're going to need you to come with us as well. We have some more questions we need to ask you. Dan nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He looked down at Jocelyn, who was watching the proceedings with wide, frightened eyes. "What about Jocelyn?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Child Protective Services is on their way," the supervisor assured him. "They'll take care of her while we sort this out. I promise she'll be safe." With a heavy heart, Dan knelt down to Jocelyn's level. "Sweetheart, I have to go answer some more questions now, but some very nice people are coming to look after you, okay? I'll see you again as soon as I can." Jocelyn's lower lip trembled, but she nodded bravely. "You promise?" she whispered. "I promise," Dan replied, giving her hand one last squeeze before allowing himself to be led away by two officers. As he was escorted to the tent that had been set up, Dan cast one last glance over his shoulder. He saw Jocelyn being gently approached by a woman in a CPS jacket, and he silently vowed to do whatever it took to ensure her safety and well-being. Inside the tent, a table had been set up with chairs on either side. Dan was guided to one of the seats, the gravity of the situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. As he waited for the questioning to begin, he could hear the muffled sounds of activity outside. Car doors slamming, radios crackling, and the low murmur of voices as the investigation into the Hale household began in earnest. For the next hour, Dan recounted every detail of his experiences at the Hale mansion. He described his observations of Jocelyn, his conversations with Maya, and the confrontations with Chris. As he spoke, Detective Reeves listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes or asking for clarification. When Dan finished his account, the detective leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed in thought. "Mr. Wells, based on what you've told us and the evidence we've gathered so far, it appears we're dealing with a case that goes far beyond simple neglect." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "The supervisor has just informed me that Mr. Hale has confessed to some disturbing details. It seems he's not Jocelyn's biological father, but her stepfather. Apparently, all the wealth came from Jocelyn's mother, Bella Lawson, who died under circumstances we now find highly suspicious." Dan felt a chill run down his spine. "And the inheritance?" he asked, remembering the fragments of conversation he'd overheard. Detective Reeves nodded grimly. "According to the will we've uncovered, all of Mrs. Lawson's considerable wealth was to pass to Jocelyn upon her 18th birthday. It seems Mr. Hale was deliberately withholding proper medical treatment, hoping—" She trailed off, but Dan understood the horrifying implication. Chris had been hoping Jocelyn would die, allowing him to inherit the fortune himself. "What happens now?" Dan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Hale is in custody," the detective replied. "We're charging him with child endangerment and neglect to start. There will likely be more charges as we uncover the full extent of his actions, possibly including the investigation into Mrs. Lawson's death. As for Jocelyn, she's been taken to the hospital for a full evaluation and treatment. Child Protective Services are working to locate any living relatives." Dan nodded, feeling a mix of relief and lingering concern. Can I see her?" Detective Reeves hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I think that can be arranged. She's been asking for you, but first, there's something else we need to discuss." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "Mr. Wells, while your actions were undoubtedly well-intentioned, taking Jocelyn from the property was technically kidnapping. Under normal circumstances, you'd be facing serious charges." Dan's heart sank, but before he could speak, the detective continued. "However, given the extraordinary circumstances and your cooperation, we're inclined to be lenient. We'll need you to sign a statement explaining your actions, but we won't be pressing charges at this time." Relief washed over Dan, and he felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Thank you," he managed to say. I couldn't leave her there, not when I knew she was suffering." Detective Reeves's expression softened slightly. "I understand. Now let's get that statement signed, and then we can arrange for you to see Jocelyn." As Dan signed the necessary paperwork, he could hear the continued bustle of activity outside the tent. The investigation was in full swing, with forensics teams combing through the mansion and officers interviewing the staff. Once the formalities were completed, Detective Reeves led Dan out of the tent. The late afternoon air felt cool on his skin after the stuffy interior. As they walked towards a waiting police car, Dan saw Maya being escorted to another vehicle. Their eyes met briefly, and Dan gave her a nod of gratitude, which she returned with a small, sad smile. "We'll be questioning Ms. Maya thoroughly," Detective Reeves explained as they got into the car. "Her testimony will be crucial in building our case." As they drove towards the hospital, Dan's mind raced with everything that had transpired. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily upon him, but underlying it all was a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. When they arrived at the hospital, a Child Protective Services worker, Laura Miller, greeted them in the lobby. "Mr. Wells," she said warmly, "Jocelyn has been asking for you. She's just finished with her initial examinations and the doctors are reviewing her case. Would you like to see her?" Dan nodded, his throat tight with emotion. As they walked towards Jocelyn's room, Laura filled him in on the girl's condition. "She's going to need extensive treatment," Laura explained softly, "but the doctors are optimistic. With proper care, they believe she still has a good chance of recovery." As they entered the room, Dan's eyes immediately found Jocelyn. She looked small and fragile in the large hospital bed, but her face lit up when she saw him. "Dan!" she called out, her voice weak but filled with relief. Dan moved to her bedside, gently taking her hand in his. "Hey there, brave girl," he said softly. "How are you feeling?" Jocelyn managed a small smile. "The doctors said they're going to make me better," she whispered. "Is it true? Can I get better now?" Dan felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," he assured her. "You're going to get all the help you need now, I promise." As he sat with Jocelyn, Dan made a silent vow. He would be there for her throughout her treatment, during the legal proceedings, and beyond. He couldn't change the past or bring back his own daughter, but he could make a difference in this child's life. Outside the room, Detective Reeves and Laura Miller watched the tender scene unfold. "We'll need to find her family," Laura mused. "Her grandparents, perhaps." Detective Reeves nodded. "We're working on it. In the meantime, it seems she's found a guardian angel in Mr. Wells." As the evening deepened outside the hospital windows, Dan remained by Jocelyn's side, a beacon of hope and protection in the storm she had weathered for so long. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, Dan felt a sense of purpose that he had thought long lost. In saving Jocelyn, he had also, in a way, saved a part of himself.